Opening the king's flank early creates immediate structural imbalances and potential tactical opportunities for both sides. Developing the knight to f6 sidesteps the immediate kingside aggression of the f4 pawn and prepares for a flexible central response. Developing a knight to support a potential d4 advance and prepare kingside castling opens up central possibilities. Unleashing a fianchetto, black embraces a familiar defensive structure, preparing to challenge white's central space and potential kingside pressure. Opening lines for a central battle, preparing for a bishop sortie. Developing the bishop to g7 perfectly utilizes the diagonal, eyeing the white king and preparing castling for swift king safety. Opening the center for immediate queenside pressure, e4 carves out space and potentially traps the bishop. Instantly securing the monarch away from the central fireworks begins a crucial phase of development and safety. Securing the king's shelter opens up possibilities for central expansion and piece development to control the d4 square. Instantly opening central lines, this pawn push immediately challenges white's e-pawn and aims to disrupt their intended kingside attack. Safeguarding the monarch, white tucks their king away, preparing for a potential central pawn push or the development of a rook to a more active file. Nabbing central influence and preparing to contest the d4 square, this knight's deployment is a logical step towards establishing active piece play and potentially undermining white's pawn structure, aiming for a balanced middle game fight. Expanding on the queen side, a4 aims to disrupt black's potential pawn advances and perhaps prepare a timely b4 to seize more territory. It's a proactive step, but one that concedes queenside space. Be mindful of how this might translate into a later queenside pawn storm for black, or potential weaknesses if white's pieces are too slow to respond. Solidifying the pawn chain's base while opening a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop offers greater flexibility for future piece development, preparing to contest central squares effectively. The queen retreats, seeking refuge from potential harassment and preparing to support a central pawn push, perhaps d4, aiming to wrestle for initiative in the game's burgeoning positional struggle. Pushing the c-pawn forward creates a complex pawn chain and immediately challenges white's queenside ambitions, potentially opening lines for black's pieces while complicating white's development and restricting the queen's activity. Suddenly, the knight jolts to the edge, seeking an unexpected outpost on the queen side, though its current position feels a bit isolated, potentially offering black an inviting target for their advancing pawns. Opening up that d-file provides a direct avenue for your rook, potentially creating significant pressure on white's slightly awkward pawn structure and the underdeveloped queen. This aggressive pawn push challenges white's central control and invites a dynamic, possibly tactical exchange that could benefit your piece activity. Capturing on d3 immediately resolves the central pawn tension, opening the bishop's diagonal and setting the stage for active piece development while also challenging black's kingside pawn structure by offering an exchange. Securing the knight's retreat path and preparing to contest the d-file are key benefits, subtly reinforcing the queenside structure while hinting at a future queenside expansion or central break. Solidifying the pawn chain across the center is the immediate goal, aiming to create a more robust defensive structure while preparing for further queenside expansion. The knight's venture to c5 injects dynamic life into black's position, challenging white's central pawn structure and eyeing the weak d3 bishop. This aggressive outpost promises potential threats against white's kingside if left unchecked, forcing white to meticulously calculate defensive maneuvers and consider sacrificing material to maintain positional integrity. Developing the bishop to c2 reinforces the queenside pawn structure and prepares to challenge black's control of the c4 square, potentially aiming to undermine the advanced pawn. A daring raid on the queenside is initiated as the knight sprints to b3, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create immediate complications on that flank. Unlocking the queenside by removing that knight is a significant positional concession for black, potentially opening the b-file for white's rook and forcing a reevaluation of black's central pawn structure, especially if white can later exploit the d4 square. challenging white's central control with a timely queen sortie. This move injects immediate dynamism into the position by exploiting the newly opened diagonal towards the enemy king. Seeking to dislodge the invading knight and regain central influence, this repositioning of the king is a sensible reaction to the queen's aggressive advance, though it leaves the monarch somewhat exposed on the king side. Seizing the b3 outpost, black's queen establishes a dominant presence on the queen side, directly challenging white's undersupported pieces and threatening to disrupt their carefully constructed pawn structure. White's knight ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's queen and knight battery on the queen side, while simultaneously eyeing the weak b6 square, which could become a staging point for further attacks if black misplaces their pieces in response. Stepping back into the shadows with the bishop, black relinquishes immediate central influence, opting to solidify the queenside structure and prepare for potential future pawn advances, while white's knight finds a temporary outpost on b5, eyeing the vulnerable c7 square. This quiet repositioning emphasizes long-term pawn chain integrity over aggressive piece play at this juncture. Initiating an attack on the kingside with f5 is a bold gambit, aiming to rupture black's pawn structure and pry open lines towards their monarch, even at the cost of weakening white's own king's shelter. Embracing the chaos, black decisively accepts the pawn sacrifice, initiating a sharp, tactical skirmish rather than a quiet positional buildup. This pawn grab on f5 immediately challenges white's aggressive pawn thrust, forcing a critical recalculation of the central pawn structure and opening lines that were previously tightly controlled. The immediate consequence is a more open board, where pieces that were previously passive can now become active participants in the ensuing melee. It's a bold choice that signals black's readiness to engage in a fight, potentially sacrificing material for initiative and dynamic counterplay. The king's safety of both sides will be under intense scrutiny from this point forward. Unleashing an attack on the kingside pawn structure, white bravely opens the e-file, aiming to exploit the newly exposed king. The exchange on f5 dramatically alters the pawn landscape, creating immediate dynamic possibilities and potentially sacrificing material for initiative. Sacrificing the bishop for immediate pawn aggression dramatically opens lines towards the white king, creating a volatile situation where precise follow-up is paramount to avoid collapsing under the resulting tactical storm. The knight's journey to d4 aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and exploit the weakness created by the recent pawn exchanges, while simultaneously defending the e-pawn and offering potential for central control. Initiating a counter-exchange, black opts to remove white's well-placed knight on d4, aiming to disrupt white's central control and open up lines for their own pieces. This decision is a direct response to white's aggressive pawn push, seeking to relieve immediate pressure and simplify the position. It's a crucial moment where black aims to rebalance the board, possibly anticipating a follow-up with Rack 8 to exploit the newly opened diagonal. Reclaiming the outpost on d4, white reasserts central influence and prepares to activate the knight on a more dynamic square, potentially eyeing the kingside or disrupting black's solid pawn structure. Sacrificing the knight here abandons the central pawn structure and opens a critical diagonal towards your king, a daring, potentially double-edged proposition that invites a sharp calculation from your opponent regarding the ensuing complications. Opening the c-file with cx-d4 immediately injects significant tension and creates an open pathway for white's rook, potentially putting pressure on black's castled king later. This action, while seemingly simple, reshapes the central dynamics, forcing black to react to the newfound positional vulnerability and consider the implications for their queen's long-term safety. Black's queen boldly infiltrates the queenside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawns and potentially disrupt white's king's safety. Unleashing the queen along the h4 diagonal immediately forces black to confront a direct threat to their king's sanctuary, a tactical gamble that disrupts the pawn structure and probes for weaknesses. Black's intention is to reinforce the pawn chain and potentially prepare for a central pawn push later, but it weakens the e6 square significantly. A daring gambit of initiative, injecting immediate chaos by targeting the f-file's openness, potentially forcing weaknesses around black's monarch or creating dangerous passed pawns. Stepping back to a safer square, the rook prepares to join the fray on the king side, a subtle but crucial step in coordinating defense and potentially launching a counterthrust. A calculated redeployment, the rook swings across the back rank, now aiming its gaze directly at the newly weakened kingside, seeking to exploit the uncovered f-file that black's earlier pawn push has inadvertently created. A calculated retreat, aiming to consolidate forces and deny white's powerful rook immediate access to the e-file, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the centralized knight. Rerouting the rook to a more active square, this maneuver prepares to contest the open e-file and supports potential advances on the king side, while also offering an escape route for the king should it become necessary to evacuate its current precarious position. Black consolidates its piece structure, offering a strategic retreat for the bishop that simultaneously opens a diagonal for potential future queen activity towards the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and pressure the slightly exposed white monarch. A bold bid to reignite the attack, pushing pawns forward to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially open lines toward the king. Securing the rook on the open file, this maneuver directly challenges white's control and aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure created by the recent exchanges, preparing for potential pressure along the c-file. A strategic repositioning of the queen, aiming to pry open lines towards the queenside and potentially create attacking chances if black's pawn structure weakens further, while also keeping an eye on central tension. Sacrificing a pawn to tear open lines toward your king, even when the opponent's queen is already so active, is a bold gambit, aiming to exploit any lingering disorganization. Asserting dominance on the kingside by launching a targeted pawn storm, 27. QG5 aims to shatter black's defensive structure and expose the monarch, creating a powerful attacking platform for white's pieces. The queen boldly ventures into enemy territory, disrupting the established pawn structure and forcing white's hand, potentially creating an immediate tactical opportunity if the white king's defenses are not meticulously managed. Opening the h-file here seems to embrace the chaos, aiming to create attacking potential against black's king while accepting significant pawn structure weaknesses on the king side. Unleashing a daring pawn thrust, black throws caution to the wind, attempting to shatter white's pawn shield and disrupt the king's security. Intensifying the assault, this maneuver seeks to leverage the open files and black's exposed king, aiming to create mating threats or force further concessions. Suddenly, the rook finds its purpose, shifting from passive defense to active counterplay, eyeing the open file with newfound ambition. The king's shelter is dangerously compromised with the doubled pawns now exposed on the h-file, creating an immediate vulnerability ripe for exploitation. The knight's capture reopens the critical d-file for black, creating an immediate attacking threat against white's king and forcing a difficult decision. Reclaiming the captured piece, but at what cost to the pawn structure, is the immediate question as the rook returns to its attacking post. Sacrificing the rook to force simplification into a seemingly lost endgame is a desperate gambit, hoping to exploit any potential endgame weaknesses white might have overlooked after this sharp exchange. Suddenly, the dynamic balance shifts as white initiates a decisive exchange, aiming to simplify into an endgame where material advantage should prevail. A well-deserved check, forcing a king reposition, and perhaps a moment for white to reconsider the exposed nature of his monarch after that pawn push. The white king finally finds some breathing room, a brief respite from the storm of exchanges, aiming to steer clear of immediate threats and perhaps prepare for a more active role later if the material imbalance allows for a prolonged game. Recapturing on f1 opens up the king's defenses, but the immediate priority is securing the rook and preventing it from becoming a target. The rook's aggressive infiltration to the b-file immediately forces a crucial decision regarding the weak b7 pawn, potentially opening lines towards black's monarch and disrupting white's defensive structure in a surprising twist after the preceding exchanges. Securing the pawn structure and preparing to activate the rook on the queen side is the immediate goal, though it subtly compromises the pawn majority on the king side by leaving it isolated. Opening the queenside flank with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially create weaknesses along the b-file, forcing black to react and potentially overextend. Opening the a-file here allows white's rook to infiltrate the queenside, creating immediate pressure on black's remaining pawns and potentially leading to an exchange that weakens black's pawn structure further. A bold attempt to activate the rook, aiming for the 7th rank to harass the black king and disrupt potential pawn advances, though it opens up lines for black's remaining pieces and sacrifices immediate pawn structure for initiative. A final desperate attempt to awaken the sleeping king and disrupt white's queenside pawn advance, though the immediate material deficit and white's robust king's safety make this more of a symbolic gesture than a genuine threat. Seizing open lines with rook exchanges often opens critical avenues, and here, the capture on a7 immediately targets weakened pawn structures, potentially setting up a swift advance toward the kingside or cutting off enemy escape routes. Seizing the open file with the rook completely reorients the endgame, as black aims to initiate pawn advances down the queenside, potentially creating unstoppable passed threats, while white's king remains somewhat exposed to potential checks from the rook's new vantage point. The rook now claims the open file, seeking to penetrate black's weakened pawn structure and disrupt any lingering defenses around the enemy king. Initiating pawn expansion offers a chance to activate the king and potentially create a passed pawn, though it also leaves the king exposed. Ra6 challenges the rook on b2 and aims to solidify control of the light squares, potentially preparing a push for the pawn to advance further into black's territory. Initiating a central pawn thrust to create immediate imbalances and potentially disrupt white's queen and rook coordination. King's forced march to the corner creates an interesting endgame dynamic where pawn structure becomes paramount. Reasserting control over the central files now becomes paramount, as the enemy king, though shielded for the moment, could become exposed with even a slight shift in the battlefield's configuration. King's safety is paramount in this tangled position, and forcing a decisive exchange of queens can significantly simplify white's path to victory. The king, now exposed, feels the chill of potential discovery as it ventures from its accustomed safety. Targeting the weak pawn on b6, this bishop maneuver aims to create a decisive queenside initiative by forcing a trade that opens up a critical file for white's rook. Seeking to pry open the king's defenses, black boldly advances the d-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and open lines for potential counterplay against the isolated queen's rook. Unleashing a potent discovered check, this move forces the black king into a decidedly uncomfortable position, highlighting the vulnerability created by the earlier pawn push. Seeking a desperate counterattack, black ignites the kingside with a bold pawn push, hoping to disrupt white's now dominant attacking formation and create chaos around the exposed monarch. Pushing the rook to the 7th rank reclaims the initiative, immediately questioning black's unprotected passed pawn and forcing a decision about its support, while simultaneously eyeing the vulnerable king. Shifting the rook to the 2nd rank aims to solidify the pawn structure and potentially reroute the piece for a more active role, perhaps targeting white's weakened kingside or supporting a central pawn push. A desperate check, aiming to disrupt the black king's sanctuary and perhaps force a favorable exchange, though the material deficit remains significant. The king, now a target for a swift attack after the rook's sacrifice, ventures out but finds itself exposed. Forking the king and rook opens up a decisive advantage, forcing a retreat that will leave the rooks vulnerable. The black king, finally finding some breathing room, ventures out to the center, a bold repositioning aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially participate in the endgame's crucial action, rather than remaining passive. Recognizing the imminent danger to the king from the rook and pawn avalanche, the white king shuffles to a slightly safer square, bracing for what promises to be a frantic defense. Shifting the bishop to the edge looks like an attempt to either a pawn, but it exposes the bishop's retreat square and leaves the kingside structure a bit loose.